So, it seems like you've got your cards all in order, right? Let's see. You have your interesting and intriguing plot, plenty of action and conflict to keep things moving, a fascinating character with plenty of depth and enough internal struggle to keep her relatable, and of course, a interesting world, a good foundation and sense of home. Well, it would seem like you're all set to write your story, right? Well, maybe there's one more thing yet to consider. Hi guys, I'm Amy Sharp, and it's time for another week of creative writing. Now, in the last couple of weeks, we've actually covered a good deal of ground. I've given you some structures to sort of consider, plot, hero's journey, how to set up your protagonist, antagonist, the importance of conflict, and of course the significance that home plays in your character's life. But now it's time to have the hammer conversation. The hammer conversation. These are all tools. Yes, I know, shocking, right? And yet, so often I've encountered people who, when you hand them the hammer, per se, the tool, and say, go over there, take care of that nail, then of course they expect to take the hammer and hammer the nail. That's what the tool's for, right? But what if I said, I want you to take this hammer and go over there and pull out that nail? Can it do that? It's a hammer. It's made for hammering. It's not a puller made for pulling. And yeah, sometimes that's how people feel when it comes to bending or breaking the structures of Freytag's pyramid or the hero's journey. Something else to always keep in mind about all these formulas and tools and things that I'm giving you, they don't replace art. I think Robin Williams in A Dead Poet Society really put his finger on it when he pointed out that true art isn't just about reaching the perfect equilibrium between structure and content, that there does have to be life and some sort of a soul breathed into it. So the missing element that I would really like to address, perhaps today for your story, is something that's a lot less quantifiable. Don't worry, I'm still going to at least attempt to give you nifty ideals, paint by the numbers if you will, but the big idea that I really want to push today is breathing art. Or to say, maybe really putting heart into your story. Let's go back and look a little bit more closely at one of our tools in our kit, Freytag's plot pyramid. If you remember Freytag's, it's the one that looks like a little mountain. It begins with exposition, the inciting incident, quickly goes into rising action, the climax, resolves to falling action, and then of course resolution and conclusion. Remember that guy? Very handy, good for chronological storytelling, everything moves in order, except what if your story's not chronological? Have you ever encountered a story that begins in the middle, in medias res, or maybe even starts at the end, and then spends the narrative backtracking and trying to explain just how everyone got there? Yeah. Do those stories still fit the tool? Well, I would say Freytag's is still useful for this reason. Often I've heard the advice, write the story that you would want to read, which I think is fantastic if you're writing for an audience of one. So you can't forget that the other part of the harmony is your audience, right? If you're going to write, someone should read it. So let's re-examine Freytag's. Instead of just being chronological, what if this can also be useful tracing the emotional impact of your story? So even if we begin at a very exciting moment, things are going on, trucks are blowing up, all that great stuff, we still will at some point have a expository moment where we find out who people are, right? Even if it is, let me tell you about how I got here. We still will be introduced to what moment in your protagonist's life changed to get them in that awkward mess. There will still be a, thrill ride, rush, escalation of events that gets us to some sort of climax that resolves the built tensions, even if we saw it in the beginning. And there will still be some sort of a emotional release through falling action, conclusion, and resolution for our audience. So when we look at it that way, as they rise and then release of impact and emotion of your story, free tags is still pretty applicable, right? Alright, at this point, I would like to mention, for all the formulas that I've been trying to introduce, for all the terminology, the tools, that's just theory. Or if you will, it's scales, chords, and arpeggios. It's the basics that you learn about storytelling and narrative so you can understand how to better express yourself through it. Or the next idea that I would like to introduce to you, swells and falls, which I'll also refer to as peaks and valleys. See, here's my idea about the way good storytelling really works. Just as somebody who's beginning to learn an instrument may concentrate very vigorously in the beginning on the technical work, playing the scales just right, making sure the chords are all in order, playing the music, key for key, note for note. The whole reason you learn the technical aspect is so that when you are comfortable enough, you can then stretch your abilities further through the music than they might have before. On the one hand, it's very nice to be able to play by ear and feel your way through the music, but that limited ability will only take you so far. It is fantastic if you have a natural talent for it, but at some point, if you plan to actually make something of that ability, well, it takes understanding of the art you're actually practicing. Okay, let me explain a little bit more about peaks and valleys. It's basically your balance and your pacing between your action and conflict versus your exposition and lulls. On the one hand, if a story has nothing but action all the way through, then it'll either be very, very short or absolutely exhausting. No, seriously, try this for a second. Take your hands and grip them as tight as you possibly can. Got it? Still got it? Still holding? Are you still holding? Hands turning blue yet? Yeah, okay. See, that's actually what nonstop action and intensity and conflict does to your audience, is at a certain point, they'll actually just go numb. Because there's no breath in between. But of course, on the other hand, if nothing really introduces conflict, if there's no friction, if everything is wonderful and everybody gets along great, and I'm sorry, even Barney and Tinky Winky had conflict in their shows. Because it's part of life. We don't believe characters or stories who have completely conflict-free lives. So, peaks and valleys, enough escalation of tension, and then a little bit of exposition to get to know your characters, to develop witty dialogue, to have fun montage scenes, or girl hanging out scenes, or bros totally do a hanging together scenes. It is necessary. Not everything has to be about tension. This is also a good place to mention that depending on what genre of story you're trying to tell, can have a very, very big influence on just how many peaks and valleys you have, and of course how intense they are in the build and the release. Obviously, if you have something that's suspense or a thriller that is all about action and what's going to happen and what's going to blow up next, then your peaks will be often and awesome. On the other hand, if you have maybe something that's more about relationships or a love story or romance, then quite frankly those hot, steamy, passionate conflict encounters may not be as frequent as the flirty, getting to know you better moments. Do you see what I mean? So this is where I also hand the ball off to you. Know the kind of story you want to write for the genre you want to paint your story in. Understand it, study it, read lots of other examples of it. It's the same as any musician who wants to play well in a field will not just read the music but also listen to how other artists have addressed it. Why wouldn't a screenwriter or a novel writer or somebody who writes songs do the same thing? Now that we've had an opportunity to see how peaks and valleys introduce a little bit more emotional escalation to our story, let's zoom in on what exactly is happening on these peaks. Right? If you took our idea of peaks and valleys and then turned it on its side and then snapped it and then just put a lock at each of those places where you had a peak, well, guess what? There you go, locks. And of course, keys are going to be how to get through them. Now, at first glance, this may seem wonderfully linear. You may be going, but Sharp, didn't we pretty much learn about this in conflict and plot? Introduce a problem, struggle, escalation, climax, sort of. But remember, today, after taking all this macro view of the big tools, we're zooming in and trying to figure out a little bit more about the specifics that are going to make your story just yours. When we talk about locks, these are specific moments of impasse in your character's journey or life or experience. There are points where not just conflict is happening, but the development of the character, him or herself, actually seems to stop for a moment until they can figure out how to get through this. Right? So this can be everything from a challenge from a schoolyard bully to finding themselves kidnapped and aboard a ship to being stranded in the middle of nowhere with a jerk as your co-passenger, right? All of these are points where your protagonist feels stuck, like they're butting up against something. And at that point, they have choices. Possibilities even. Although really, the biggest choices belong to you. See, every time your character reaches one of those moments of impasse, one of the locks, you have a different opportunity of how it's going to be resolved. Of course, your protagonist could win. Yay! They are clever, they are strong, they are faster than the man-eating hyenas. They win. Excellent. But what if they don't? It won't break your story, I promise. Yes, even with the man-eating hyenas. There's ways to get out of that. Your character can also, besides winning, they can also lose or draw. Each of these introduced myriads of fascinating possibilities for not only the development of your character, but where your story can go. I mean, after all, we said before in character that if your protagonist is a little bit too perfect, a little bit too overpowered, there's just nothing that can stand in their way, or their wonderful charm, then it's kind of a Mary Sue. It's just not as interesting. So would it really kill your story if instead of winning each of those challenges, what if they went to a draw? Or what if they just out and out lost? There have actually been some brilliantly written stories out there in which the protagonists lose, and sometimes at really pivotal moments. Talk about a darkest before the dawn kind of feeling. But that's what we love about storytelling, because if you as the writer can figure out a way to make your character lose, and yet somehow still make the whole entire story win, well, now that's taking the art of storytelling to a whole new level. Alright, so now we reach the interesting part of our new lyrical understanding of pacing, tone, and emotional impact. Now that we have peaks to help escalate the emotion and valleys to lure us into a sense of false repose. Now that we have locks to challenge our protagonists to be cleverer, stronger, better than they were before, and keys to help them on their path to triumph, we need to get a bit sneakier about how we hide those keys. Just before we wrapped up last time with character and setting, I introduced you to 6 other character types besides hero and shadow who might show up in your story, the archetypes. Well, I would like to revisit those just in case they could play a interesting, useful part in your story. So, let's start out with the ally. This is your hero's best bud, their partner in crime, the epitome of the sidekick. This is an individual that they've either known all their life, or they meet pretty early on in the story, and they just really hit it off. So this is the Ron Weasley to your Harry Potter, or the Han Solo to your Luke Skywalker, or the Louise to your Thelma. Whatever you like. It's someone that your protagonist or hero can really count on. Usually they have maybe sort of a slightly opposite personality, so your protagonist doesn't always have to get along with the ally, but all the better to sometimes pull out more of that internal conflict we might not get to see in your hero unless your ally is there to talk it out of them. On that topic, let's not overlook the importance of a guiding figure in your protagonist's life. This would be the mentor, so your Obi-Wan Kenobi, or your Professor Dumbledore, or Gandalf, right? Any of those figures who are the voice of reason, but also wisdom and insight. They're also usually the encouragers to your protagonist, maybe helping them be a little bit more courageous, a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more heroic along the way. Beside your mentor, we have a couple characters who may not get as much screen time, and in fact, they don't always show up as characters. The first one is the Herald. Just to remind you, the Herald is that figure who shows up with the voice, the message that propels your protagonist, your hero, into the adventure to begin with. Sometimes in a good way, sometimes not. At the moment, I'm thinking of Hagrid in Harry Potter. Yes, there were owls sent ahead of times with an actual message to Harry, but the one who actually went to fetch Harry and literally kicked down the door of opportunity for our protagonist to join the Wizarding world was none other than Hagrid. Another character who sometimes doesn't get a whole lot of attention is the Threshold Guardian. Now, this is a character who at some point may test the mettle or the resolve of your hero. So it could be a upperclassman who's not so sure this young upcoming punk really deserves to be on the team, so they need a challenge, a little dare to find out if they're worth their salt. In older stories, like King Arthur and Lancelot, it was a actual head-on-head challenge. King Arthur had to try to defeat Lancelot at combat to prove that he was the right and noble man who would unite the kingdom, take over Camelot, all that good stuff. Let me see, besides the Threshold Guardian, we of course get the Changeling. Now, the Changeling is an interesting character, not quite an ally, but still part of the party. You can't always be entirely sure whose side the Changeling is on, because often the Changeling is out for their own interests, their own goals. They're on their own side. So whether it's a character who just keeps your audience guessing, or, more often than not, it's the love interest, or character of the opposite sex, because who knows what they're thinking, right? The Changeling is a character who represents ambiguity, who gives both the hero and the audience a sense of question, maybe some unease as far as where the Changeling's loyalties actually lie. And of course, this leads us to our last archetype, the Trickster. The Trickster can be a lot of fun. If you think of all the comedic reliefs, all the gag characters, the ones who always have the funniest lines or the greatest shticks, those are usually going to be their tricksters. They get to be the voice of the people. It's true. Whenever there's something particularly absurd or bizarre, you can bet the trickster is going to be the one who points it out. See, they get the privilege of being the court jester. Even though they may be playing the idiot or the fool in the party, because of that, they also sort of get a pass on commenting on other people's foolishness. So, along with their own ridiculous predicaments, they at least get to puncture the ego or poke holes in the theories of other characters as well. One last thing I would like to say about all these archetypes: they're not necessarily cast in iron. The wonderful thing about them is that a lot of times they'll actually overlap or even change roles. Take C-3PO and R2-D2 from Star Wars. The first one, you know what I mean. Originally, the droids showed up more as heralds. They were literally the messengers of Princess Leia's call for help. But later on, through their own adventures and exploits, they pretty much become both ally and even trickster. Sometimes, again, appearing very comical and ridiculous, but also commenting on certain ridiculous behaviors around them also. One other thing I should add here is that I've been explaining and describing our archetypes in relation to the protagonist. Don't forget that the Shadow also gets an entourage, all of his or her own sometimes. So the Shadow may also have their own ally or sidekick, mentor, herald, guardian, changeling, and trickster. Yeah, it can work both ways. And with that, it means that the ways you put your characters together or how you choose to paint them in your story, it's nearly endless. And characters, just like people, can and should be continuously changing, morphing, adapting or adjusting to whatever circumstances they're put in. It's what makes a story interesting. We can't wait to see what happens next or who someone will turn out to be. The reason that we want to get to know our side characters, our archetypes, a little bit better is because they make wonderful places to hide keys. Yes, your side characters can each have storylines, locks, and keys all of their own. And this, by tying not just one character's development, but many characters' development together, creates a very rich tapestry of almost endless possibilities. Imagine, if you will, that now no longer is each lock just win, lose, or draw, but now each key has a specific way to earn it unto itself. It's not just about one character gunning their way through a storyline all under their own power. Now the narrative becomes interwoven and more interconnected with what the characters have to go through with each other in order to help each other along the narrative's way. At the end of the day, all the theories, all the constructs, all the characters that I've introduced you to are still just words on a page. They're still just learning the structure so that once you get comfortable, you can then begin to create art and express the story the way that you want it to. If, in the course of writing your story, you find yourself getting stuck again, well then, revisit where we've been. Did you plan out your action? Do you know how you want it to unfold? Do you know your characters well? All of them. Did you remember to take a few chances? Step outside the box. Let yourself have fun. And if something's not working, break it. Say it's not working if you're not moving forward. Ask yourself, why does it have to operate this way? What happens if you change it? At the end of the day, dreams and stories not only share the ability to show us new worlds and experiences that we might otherwise not see, dreams and stories also open up a myriad of possibilities. And I hope now that you have a few more ideas, a few more techniques under your belt, that you'll take this opportunity as well to dream a little bit further and to write that story that you've been thinking about for a while. All right. Thank you for joining me today. Keep writing. I'm Amy Sharp, and I'll see you next time. Our peaks and our valleys, our emotional expression, our cat, who has to make at least one appearance for video. Yeah. Alright, you running the game now, huh? Ugh. Remember, the one thing... I was so close! I was so close! It's not the one thing. Dreams and stories may show... Just before we finished up with character and setting last time, I introduced you to 6 other guys, besides of course our hero and our shadow, who could potentially show up in your stories. And now I'm gonna sneeze. We done? Nope.